In the summer of 1846, a railway construction inspector named Samuel Briggs walked the length of the newly completed Birmingham Curzon Street station for the last time before the building was handed over to the London and Birmingham Railway for passenger service. He had overseen the station's construction for 22 months. He knew every column, every arch, every flagstone in its floor. He was making his final inspection notes when he found, in the easternmost basement storage room, something that the construction ledgers he had maintained for 22 months made no reference to, and that he could not account for in any way. A section of the stone floor, approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, had been cut away and relaid sometime after the original pour, with a precision that matched the surrounding floor so exactly that the joint was almost invisible to the eye. He felt it with the sole of his boot before he saw it. He knelt down and ran his fingers along the seam. It was a perfect cut, not a repair, not a patch, a deliberate opening and resealing, executed with the care of someone who did not want it found. He noted it in his inspection report as a floor anomaly requiring investigation, photographed the seam with a chalk outline so that it would be visible in the report, and submitted the report to the London and Birmingham Railway's chief engineer the following week. The chief engineer's written response, received 8 days later, described the anomaly as a minor settling effect in the stone substrate and recommended no further action. Briggs had been a construction inspector for 16 years. He had seen settling effects in stone floors. What he had described in his report was not a settling effect. He signed the completion certificate, handed over the building, and wrote a single line in his personal inspection diary, a diary he had kept for every project of his career that was different in character from every other line he had written in 16 years of professional notes. It read, "Floor anomaly, Curzon Street East Basement. Not settling, not our work, not explained." The London and Birmingham Railway's construction records for Curzon Street Station are held in the National Railway Museum Archive in York under a Railway Company record series. The chief engineer's response to Briggs's report is in that archive. The report itself, the one Briggs submitted with the chalk outlined photographs of the floor seam, is not. The archive's accession index for the Curzon Street construction series lists a final inspection report from Briggs for the autumn of 1846. The physical file contains the completion certificate, the construction ledgers, and the cost accounts. It does not contain the inspection report, Briggs's personal inspection diary, which he maintained throughout his career and which his family donated to the Birmingham City Archives in 1904, is held there under a Briggs Family Papers accession. The diary entry for the Curzon Street final inspection is dated September 3rd, 1846. It is the only entry in 16 years of professional notes that describes work he did not do and a response he did not believe. Briggs was not a man given to professional complaint or institutional suspicion. He had spent 16 years working within the railway construction industry at a moment of extraordinary expansion, had delivered projects on time and within budget, and had maintained the kind of professional record that earned a man repeated commissions and institutional trust. He was not, by any measure his career suggests, someone who imagined anomalies where none existed. He was someone who had spent 16 years noticing the difference between what a floor does when it settles and what a floor does when it has been cut and relayed by a skilled mason. He knew the difference because his profession required him to know it. And when the chief engineer told him the difference did not matter, he closed the file, accepted the explanation he did not believe, and wrote 4 words in his diary that he had never written before: "Not our work." Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Samuel Briggs found in the basement of Curzon Street Station, we have to go back, not just to the railway mania of the 1840s that produced the first generation of great British stations, and not just to the architects and engineers who designed them. We have to go back to a question that the official history of Victorian railway architecture has never asked in any systematic way: why the stations built in the first wave of British railway construction, the wave that produced Curzon Street, Euston, Temple Meads, and Lime Street in the span of a single decade, were built to scales and with structural specifications that the passenger volumes of their opening years did not require, and that the engineers who built them never publicly explained. The official account of Victorian railway station design presents the monumental scale of the first generation as an expression of institutional ambition, railway companies announcing themselves through the architectural vocabulary of permanence and grandeur. That is a plausible cultural explanation. It does not account for the engineering. The great stations of the 1830s and 1840s were not simply large. They were structurally specified to tolerances their passenger volumes did not require. The load-bearing calculations for Euston, Temple Meads, and Lime Street were engineered for loads significantly greater than any projected first-decade traffic. Foundation depths were, in several documented cases, greater than soil conditions and building weights required. Basement levels were larger, better finished, and more carefully ventilated than any storage or service function of the period would demand. And in several first-generation stations, access to those basement levels was restricted from the building's opening day in ways that the official function of a station basement, coal storage, luggage handling, maintenance, would not explain. An engineer named Robert Fenwick, who was employed by the Great Western Railway's Engineering Division from 1841 to 1869, was assigned in 1847 to produce a structural assessment of Bristol Temple Meads in preparation for a planned expansion of the station's passenger capacity. His assessment covered every level of the building, including the basement. His report, submitted to the GWR in March of 1848, is held in the National Archives under the Great Western Railway Company Records Series. The section on the basement level describes, in clinical engineering language, the presence of a ventilation system in the basement that Fenwick assessed as significantly over-specified for any storage or service function. The ventilation channels were larger in diameter, more numerous, and distributed in a pattern that Fenwick described as inconsistent with the ventilation requirements of any storage use he was familiar with. He noted that the pattern was consistent with the ventilation of a space in active regular use by a significant number of people. Not storage, not occasional maintenance, but occupation. He did not conclude from this that the basement had been occupied. He simply noted the specification anomaly and moved on. His report was received, the planned expansion proceeded, and the ventilation anomaly was never addressed in any subsequent WR document he was aware of. His report is accessible at the National Archives. The ventilation anomaly is on page 9. It has not been cited in any published architectural history of Bristol Temple Meads. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the great railway stations of the 1830s and 1840s were built on sites that had not been empty, for functions that were not limited to the passenger service that the official opening records describe, and that the structures handed over to the railway companies at completion contained infrastructure, basement levels, floor configurations, ventilation systems, whose specifications exceeded what the railway companies had commissioned, and whose purpose has never been entered into the official record of any of these buildings. The argument that underlies this research is straightforward when you examine the engineering. The railway companies of the 1830s and 1840s We're building a new kind of building for a new kind of use, with no tradition of station architecture to draw from. And yet the engineering specifications of the structures they produced, in several cases, appear to reflect knowledge of what those buildings would need to do that went beyond anything their passenger projections justified. Someone designed those basements for heavier use than coal storage. Someone designed those ventilation systems for occupied space. Someone cut and resealed a section of the Curzon Street basement floor before the building was handed over and left no record of having done so. Liverpool Lime Street, 1836, the original station building, demolished in 1867 and replaced by the current structure, was described in a report by a Liverpool Corporation surveyor named George Aldous. Commissioned in 1849 to assess the building's structural condition following a complaint about subsidence. Aldous's report is in the Liverpool Record Office under a Corporation Surveyor's Records series. In it, Aldous notes that the subsidence complaint was not substantiated by his structural examination, but that during his investigation, he had discovered, beneath the platform level, a series of chambers that did not appear in the original construction plans filed with the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. He described the chambers as well built, ventilated, and connected to each other by passages of a width sufficient for 2 people to pass. He estimated the total area of the chamber system at approximately 300 square feet. He asked the Liverpool and Manchester Railway for documentation of the chamber's construction. The railway's response, which Aldous quoted in his report, stated that the chambers predated the railway's construction of the station and were a feature of the site's previous use. The railway did not describe what the site's previous use had been. Aldous did not pursue the question. His report concluded with the subsidence finding, none, and closed. London Euston, 1839, a maintenance contractor named Arthur Peel, engaged to repair drainage in the station's eastern service passages 2 years after opening, wrote in his project notebook that he had encountered a sealed door set into the passage wall at a depth below the documented basement floor. Heavy oak, iron-banded, with a lock whose keyhole pattern he had not previously seen. He sketched it and asked the station superintendent for access authorization. The superintendent's written response, which Peel copied into his notebook, states that the door was part of secure storage infrastructure, that access was restricted to authorized company personnel, and that Peel's drainage work did not require him to enter the secured area. Peel's project notebook is in a private collection, examined by a researcher in 2011. The researcher noted that Peel's own project specifications show he had no reason to be in the passage where he found the door. He had found it while exploring beyond his work scope. He had been told, in official language, that it was none of his business. Manchester-Liverpool Road, 1830, the world's first purpose-built railway passenger station, now a museum, was subjected to a full archaeological and structural survey by English Heritage in 1998 as part of a heritage listing review. The survey report, a publicly available document, notes in its structural analysis section that the station's ground floor level, in its eastern section, shows evidence of a previous floor surface at a depth of approximately 18 inches below the current floor, a surface whose material composition and laying technique are, the survey notes, inconsistent with any construction phase documented in the station's known building history. The survey does not attribute the subfloor surface to any construction episode. It notes the inconsistency and moves on. It is on page 47 of the survey report. It has not been cited in any published history of Liverpool Road Station or in any subsequent heritage documentation for the site. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. But here is what makes Samuel Briggs' diary entry different from every other account of pre-existing infrastructure in the first-generation railway stations. In 1889, 43 years after Briggs made his final inspection at Curzon Street, the London and Birmingham Railway, by then absorbed into the London and North Western Railway, commissioned a structural review of the station building's east wing as part of an evaluation of the building's long-term use. The review was conducted by a structural engineer named Edward Parr, who had no knowledge of Briggs's 1846 inspection diary or of the floor anomaly Briggs had reported. Parr descended to the east basement storage room. He prepared a measured floor plan of the space. He noted, in his review, a section of the floor, approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, that showed a different stone grain and a marginally different surface patina from the surrounding floor. He described it in his written review as a replaced section of flooring, likely a repair to earlier damage, and recommended no action. His written review is in the National Railway Museum Archive in York, in the same record series as the original Curzon Street construction documents. If you hold Parr's 1889 floor plan against Briggs's 1846 inspection notes, the notes, not the report, which is missing, the dimensions of the section Parr describes as a repair and the section Briggs described as a deliberate opening and resealing are identical. 8 feet by 12 feet. Same room, same position, same floor. 43 years apart. 2 engineers, neither knowing the other had seen it, both noting it, neither being told what it was. The National Railway Museum has never adequately addressed several specific questions about the structural record of Curzon Street Station. It has never explained why the final inspection report submitted by Samuel Briggs in 1846, which the Archive Index lists as received, does not appear in the physical file. It has never explained why the chief engineer's response to a report that has since disappeared describes the report's content in terms that match Briggs' diary account of what he had reported. It has never explained why a section of floor in the east basement that Briggs measured as a deliberate resealing in 1846 was measured by an independent engineer 43 years later in identical dimensions and described as a repair in a building whose maintenance records contain no record of any repair to that floor in the intervening period. Why does the Liverpool and Manchester Railway's response to George Aldous describe the Lime Street chambers as predating the railway's construction without describing what use predated it? Why does a drainage contractor's project notebook contain a copied official response denying him access to a sealed door that his own project specifications show he had no reason to approach? Why does the English Heritage Survey of the world's oldest railway station note a subfloor surface of unknown origin, inconsistent with any documented construction phase, and then not ask what it is? Why, in station after station, does the pre-existing infrastructure appear in the record once? In one engineer's report, one surveyor's notebook, one Heritage Survey footnote, and then stop being mentioned? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we have are a diary entry in the Birmingham City Archives, a ventilation anomaly on page 9 of a GWR report at the National Archives, a surveyor's note about chambers predating railway construction in the Liverpool Record Office, a contractor's notebook with a copied denial letter, a Heritage Survey footnote about an unexplained subfloor surface, and an 1889 structural review whose floor measurements match a 1846 inspection exactly, in a building whose maintenance records show no repair between those two dates, and a pattern of institutional response across the London and Birmingham Railway, the Great Western Railway, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and English Heritage that in every case chose description over investigation, moved on rather than asked why, and left the anomaly in the footnote where it could be found by anyone who looked and ignored by everyone who didn't. For the remaining 23 years of his career after Curzon Street, Samuel Briggs continued to work as a construction inspector on railway projects across the Midlands. He never submitted another anomaly report. He kept his diary. He was a professional, and the matter at Curzon Street was, professionally, closed. The chief engineer had responded. The completion certificate had been signed. The building had been handed over. What he had found and what he had been told about it were two different things, and he had written the difference in 4 words and then gone back to work. When he died in 1871, his family found the diary among his papers, recognized it as a professional record, and kept it. His grandson donated it to the Birmingham City Archives in 1904, along with other family papers. The archivist who received it catalogued it as a construction inspector's professional diary 1830-1867. The Curzon Street entry is on page 214. It is 9 lines. The last 4 words are, "Not our work." The east basement of Curzon Street Station still exists. The building has been partially converted and partially preserved since its closure to regular passenger traffic in 1893. The section under preservation includes the basement levels. The 8x12 section of floor that Briggs measured in 1846 and that Parr measured in 1889 is, if the floor has not been replaced in the century since Parr's review, still there. No subsequent structural review of the building has noted it. No heritage documentation of the building has described it. Somewhere beneath a floor in a building that has been listed, surveyed, and written about for 150 years, a seam runs in a rectangle that 2 engineers measured and neither could explain, and that one of them, in a diary no one was supposed to read, called "Not Our Work." The official history tells us that the great railway stations of the 1830s and 1840s were purpose-built for passenger service, designed by the engineers the railway companies hired, and handed over at completion as new buildings on prepared sites. What the inspection reports and the structural assessments and the surveyor's notebooks tell us is that some of those buildings were not new when they were handed over, that some of those sites were not empty when the railway companies arrived, and that the engineers who found the evidence of what had been there before were, in each case, told by the institutions above them that the evidence was not their concern. They accepted that. They were professionals, and it was not their concern. But they wrote it down, and some of what they wrote down survived long enough for someone to find it. Not our work. That is what Briggs wrote. 4 words. It is the most precise description in this entire account of what the official history of these buildings has never been willing to say. These records survive because people refuse to stop looking. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when you build a railway station over it. It disappears when no one opens the basement door. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects Samuel Briggs's floor anomaly to a land purchase record filed with the Birmingham Corporation in 1835, 11 years before Curzon Street Station opened. The London and Birmingham Railway purchased the site in 1835 from a private vendor whose name appears in the purchase deed as a nominee. The nominee's principal is not named in the deed. What is named, in a single notation at the foot of the deed, is the condition attached to the sale, that the purchaser agreed to maintain, in perpetuity, access to a specified subsurface level of the site for the benefit of the unnamed principal's successors in interest. The station was built. The condition was recorded. The principal was never named. Their successors have never come forward. The deed is in the Birmingham City Archives. The condition is on the final page. No railway historian has cited it.